So before we get started, Don, I've got to say to you, happy birthday. You don't look a day over 20.
Oh, well, I feel about 120, but that's okay. I'll take it.
Congratulations, happy birthday. I'm really excited about this one. I remember as a young fighter growing up, in boxing, and I'm quite sure you'd probably, you might disagree or might agree, it's either heavyweights or the middleweights. They were the 100 meters. That was the 100 meters final. The heavyweights on the middleweights. We're talking the middleweights now. As in middleweights, we're talking Sugar Ray Robinson. This man wasn't originally a middleweight, but he stamped his authority in the boxing world, as a middleweight. Tell me a little bit about him.
Ever since I've been around boxing, and that's when I was about 17, selling little programs outside of Madison Square Garden, writing little articles, I have never heard anyone, and this goes back to people who were 70 or 80 at the time, say that Sugar Ray Robinson wasn't the greatest fighter of all time, pound for pound, in any weight division, just a paragon that every fighter before him and after him were measured. Nat Fleischer, who was from the 1880s, he rated him 6th in the middleweights. Probably was a greater welterweight than the middleweight, though his achievements were greater in the middleweight division. He's the only person that didn't rate Robinson as the greatest fighter that ever lived. And I've heard it constantly. You almost couldn't go through life in this industry that he's the fighter by which everyone else is measured. Heavyweights, flyweights, welterweights, everyone.
Yeah, and the thing is, when you get an accolade like that from other fighters, other active fighters, saying this guy was the best fighter ever to lace the gloves on, that is unquestionable. You've got scribes all over the world that can have an opinion on what fighter is brilliant, and some guys have never put a glove on in their life. But if other fighters are talking about the likes of Sugar Ray Robinson as the best fighter they've ever seen, and I would say that myself. In prepping for this, I was looking at his fights. I thought, this guy was years ahead of his time. An outstanding amateur, came on the scene, 1939, fighting at featherweight?
Yes, fights at featherweight. He turned pro about 90. Turned pro on the Henry Armstrong Fritzy Civic card, which in those days it would be the tantamount. Turning pro Madison Square Garden was like turning pro on national television. Few, if any, fighters ever did it. Some years later, George Foreman did it after winning the Olympic gold medal. But his reputation was such in the New York area that he was granted what would have been a 10-round fighter. You had 10-round fights fighting 6 rounds to get on these big Madison Square Garden cards in the 20s, 30s, 40s, and 50s. And he was there, his pro debut in the Garden, in front of 21,000 people at the Armstrong Civic fight. And John, just to quickly interject, how great a fight he was at the amateurs. There weren't no Olympics in 1940 because of the war. So he was a double Golden Glove champ. He had 101 wins, I think 3 losses as an amateur. And as an amateur, he beat Willie Pep. So the greatest guy in his generation that he was compared to was Willie Pep, and he beat him. And then as a pro, he went on to beat Henry Armstrong. So this is how phenomenal this man was. Everything he did was on the A1 top level.
What was it? Because especially a black man at that time in America, to achieve the accolade, to achieve the successes, to have such success. How did he get such backing? I know our sport is one of those sports where it's not really about color. It's about if you can win. Once you can win, you can win. That's what's most important. But everything seemed to fall into place for him.
He was the quintessential urban hero. I mean, the blacks in America, you came from the South and they emigrated north. That's generally the situation. Joe Louis was a Southern black, which this perception of a humbler man, a quieter person, just because of their background. They didn't grow up in the city lights. They grew up on a farm or a plantation in rural America, just like a white person would have grown up in rural America. But Sugar Ray was born in Georgia, but as an infant, his family moved to Detroit, and then they moved to New York. So he was city slick from the time, fancy suits, tailor-made suits, fancy shoes, beautiful hats. He was the epitome of class. He was stylish. He was a guy that was the city boy coming to life. He wasn't a country boy, became city boy. He was a city boy. So the whole perspective was different. He moved at a faster pace. He knew how to dress. He had the swagger with him from the minute he turned amateur. He just was a natural born winner, a natural born star. He was the New York fighter, and he lived that to the fullest.
You know, it reminds me, I think it's Garcia today, the youngsters coming through, and they represent, he probably represented the sign of the times. He could dance, he could sing, he could dress, he was a slick, he was a showman, slick dresser and everything. So, so it was someone for fans to dream about or wish they could be this real live guy.
Yeah, he was there. He was a model, role model for anybody. As I said, he was the New York fighter when New York was at the zenith of its creative and cultural height, and he just epitomized it. He drove around in the pink Cadillac. He owned bars, he owned restaurants. There was Sugar Ray. You know, it was classy. He could dance. He became a dancer for a while after he retired from boxing. He was just the guy, and of course, the women went crazy over him. He never had just a even had a harem walking around after him. So just this phenomenon. And again, he was such a prodigious genius as a fighter that even when he was 15, 16, 17, he had a reputation as great as any world champion before he turned pro. So when he got turning pro in the Garden was like making a debut on national television. He was just that kind of a reputation. And then it just grew as he was professional.
So you look at let's look at his career. Look at the fighters he got in with, and you know, you talk. The word legend is thrown around far too easily in most sports, especially in boxing. And when people say that, I think, do you really actually know what stripes you're giving an individual when you say that? There are very, very, very few legends, real legends, history makers in our sport. I think Ray Robinson was that fighter where you would look and think, even now, years later, you'd look at how this guy boxed, how he showboated, how he could fight southpaw and orthodox, how he could fight on the defensively and offensively, and again, what he did was he made outstanding fighters look ordinary.
He just was again a phenomenon. Look, before he was the champion, he ran up a scheme. He was undefeated in 91 straight fights. Then he lost to Jake LaMotta, who he fought 5 times. You know, ultimately the last one being for the middleweight title. He became the first guy to stop, win it in spectacular fashion. But before he was champion, I always use the Hall of Famers criteria because always great fighters. Every fighter who could claim to be great is in there. And he had beaten Kit Gavilan twice before he won the middleweight title. He beat Sammy Angat twice before his welterweight champ. He beat Fritzy Zivic twice, and he beat Henry Armstrong, and he beat Jake LaMotta. 5 Hall of Famers before he was ever the world champion. This is the kind of phenomenon that he was as a great fighter, and every other contender. I mean, knocking them out left and right, 1-round knockouts, blowouts, just amazing. And so he was a truly great fighter even before he was the champion. He was an undefeated in 60-odd fights, you know. So he was great on almost every level before he matured. And then he wins the welterweight title, completely dominates it, and then moves on to the middleweight title and wins it for an unprecedented 5 times.
The mindset was very different then than it is now, and fighters are lost. You know, they look at it as the end of their career, the end of their credibility, but for him, he lost 19 fights out of his career, only getting stopped once. The losses didn't really affect his growth, his ambition, his development at all. I remember him losing to Randolph Turpin.
Yes.
Randolph Turpin here, and people don't realize how much of a big deal that actually was for Randolph Turpin. And maybe Randolph Turpin would have got more accolade from that win if in the rematch, which was 64, 68 days later, he got turned over again. So if he managed to keep hold of it, then you wouldn't think it was a fluke.
Yes.
But he had the trappings of success and fame of beating the famous, the unbelievable Sugar Ray Robinson. And that's what got to him.
Oh, 100% got him into the Boxing Hall of Fame. You know, he did have a shot to win the title afterwards against Bobo Olsen and lost Randolph. So some guys reached their level, and that was it. He had that one great night, but it immortalized Randolph. And you know, and amazing how guys in those days, as you said, 64 days later, the euphoria of winning the world title, didn't take a day off, came right back to fight Ray Robinson. And where's he fight him? In the Polo Grounds. And where's the Polo Grounds? In Harlem. So you're fighting the king of Harlem, in Harlem, in his castle. And 61,000 people turned out for that rematch 64 days later. Unbelievable. And Ray was already 30 years old. He was past his peak. You bring up the 19 losses, 14 of those when he was after 30 years of age. So almost all of them post-winning his championship. Up until that point, he had lost the one fight to LaMotta, fought a rematch with him 16 days later and beat him, fought an intermediate fight in between and beat that guy. Then he loses to Turpin, regains the title, loses to Joey Maxim for the light heavyweight championship. And then he retires, makes a comeback, loses to Tiger Jones, beats Bobo Olsen for the world title, loses the title back to Fulmer, regains the title, loses to Basili. But at that point, 1958, when Ray is 37, he had only lost 4 fights. So all the fights are post being middleweight champ, which is quite incredible. And he fought until his 40th and against the best contenders even after he was champion. Just again, everything about him is, it's almost, you could make it up in a fictionalized novel. To believe it today, 200 odd fights, over 100 knockouts, 180 victories. Fighters don't do that in 3 careers today.
Even when he boxed Doyle, I think he said before the fight that he was going to pull out the Doyle fight. Unfortunately, lost his life in that fight. They called the priest. They got everybody to say, "Look, no, it was just a dream." But he dreamt the result of the fight, which, you know, for many people, when they say and speak things like this, it's hard to actually envisage, understand, or actually believe. I believe that. I believe fighters can actually, if you're that immersed in it, if you're that sunk into your sport, I believe you do. There's certain premonitions that you get. I had them as a fighter. I'm quite sure many other fighters have had them in the past. But that was one fight that nearly made him walk away from the sport.
Yeah, well, you'd know better than anyone. You heard a guy. Nobody wants to kill anybody. I don't care. Maybe you get enraged, but that's never the object of a boxing match, to win. And when it happens, it does affect guys. Some fighters have lost their entire career after that. They can't mentally adjust. And it's hard. It's very hard. You have to overcome it. I could never imagine what it was like. I'm assuming you've had guys that you've hurt, you know, badly, and for a moment you don't know what happened. You're hoping they come out of it, but it's very, very tough. And the reaction was very callous. Some people thought of Robinson, but it is something you just got to put behind you and go forward.
Yeah, I think it was the fact that he dreamt it the night before.
Yes,
and that was what got that. Fighters that are watching this and think, you know, I get that. I've dreamt my fights before, and it is scary. So Don, I've got to ask you. You know, I always like it when you actually tell me stories of fights that you're actually there, stood outside selling little tickets or stuff like that. You're actually there. You know the atmosphere. Talk me through the big nights, the big nights of Ray Robinson. The fights that stand that test of time. The fights that the public want to speak about.
Well, you know, I have to speak in the second part. I didn't see Ray Robinson fight in person. I did meet him once at a gala in Beverly Hills with Henry Armstrong. So that's my only exposure. And seeing him introduced in the ring, I'll get that as part of the story.
What was he like before you get there? What was he like as an individual?
Well, you know, I only meant to say hi, and that was me. And behind a queue of 400 people, sort of like meeting Queen Elizabeth, and you sort of genuflect and you shake, walk on to the next party. No, smiled and everything else like that. I do remember at the Ali Frazier, and this is the biggest fight of all time in my existence. And they had, you know, Johnny Addy, the famous, they introduced Willie Pep and Sandy Sadler and Rocky Graziano and Gene Tunney. And they say there's 3 more. And he says, here he is, the Manassa Mauler, an explosion, 21,000 people. Jack Dempsey hardly got the words out. And he's the 25 title defenses, the Brown Bomber Joe, they knew who it was. Joe Louis, and this again, Ali Frazier, biggest fight of all time in the Garden. They could contain it like the atom bomb went off. Crazy with Louis. He says, one more, final one. He says, hometown boy, 5-time middleweight. He couldn't finish the words. I still tear up. Couldn't say, Sugar, that was it. It was like the hydrogen bomb went off and Sugar Ray Robinson, the last guy introduced before Ali Frazier. That's the esteem he was held in 20 years after his last fight, almost. He topped Joe Louis. He topped Jack Dempsey. He topped Gene Tunney. He topped Willie Pep. He took the greatest of the greats. They saved them to the last. So that's what they thought of Sugar Ray Robinson.
So you had the black community when they looked at fighters and they looked up to fighters, think, you know what, you're doing what we'd want to do. And I suppose they could... they'd look up to the likes of Ali. They'd look up to the likes of Jack Johnson. They'd look at for Sugar Ray. For him, how much of an impact, how much of a lift, how much did it do for society, socially for people?
Well, remember, he had his businesses in Harlem, 125th Street, 137th Street. He had a cafe, he had a bar, he had a clothing store. I mean, he was like the king of Harlem. This was the king of Black America at that time. He wasn't political by any stretch of the imagination, but just that, again, the symbolism. You saw him. He was dressed to the nines. He had the Fanta, the pink Cadillac. I mean, he was the man. He was the man, no question. He was Superfly before Superfly was there, and just you wanted to emulate him. He had the hairstyle. He had everything. Joe Louis had humility and everything. He was the great fight. He was more profound, I think, in terms of political contribution, or profound as historical contribution, because he came a generation before Ray. But Ray was the guy. He was on television. That's another thing. So millions saw Ray when he fought. Joe was in the films. Joe was in the stadium. But Ray was drawing him live, and he was drawing him, through television. You turn it on, and everybody in the country saw Sugar Ray Robinson at his peak.
What was that fight? What was the fight? The fight that the public thought maybe this is it. This is his day of reckoning. This guy he's a tough ass. This guy's a tough fight. What was the fight? That major fight that got the imagination of the public?
Well, again, on the way up, it's his Just Pro debut, knocking a guy, Joe Echeverria, in 2 rounds in the Garden on 21,000 people on the Armstrong card. They walked away knowing him. Then he beats Henry Armstrong before he's champ. Then he gets the rematch with LaMotta 16 days after his first loss and vindicates himself. But the fight, I think, that measured his career was the one we talked about earlier with Randy Turpin. He goes to England. He loses the title. It's a front page story in the New York Times, which is like the London Times. It's not the Daily Mail. It's not the sporting paper. It merited that. He takes the rematch in the Polo Grounds. Again, this Polo Grounds was so symbolic. It was the home of the New York Giants, for a while the New York Yankees. All the great fights in history had been there up until that point, because it was so, they seated 80,000. So the Garden would have their big fights there in the summer. Dempsey Firpo was called the fight of the century, was in the Polo Grounds. The Louis Billy Kahn fight in the Polo Grounds. Other major, Harry Greb and Mickey Walker in the Polo Grounds. So the Carnival, all the greatest of the great had fought there. Leonard and Tunney, Henry Armstrong, or Ray's early idol. And he comes back with his rematch. He loses the championship overseas to vindicate himself. He fights at home in the ballpark that he could walk to from his house. 61,000 people at that ballpark. The action, the intensity of him. Can he regain the title? Remember, Ray was 30 years of age. Was he shot? Was he gone? He gets his eye cut. They're going to stop the fight. And he comes out in the 10th round and fights his heart out, pins Turpin to the ropes and stops him. And the crowd goes insane. It was a national holiday in Black America.
Was that fight what was it, 12th of the 9th of December? It was 1951. Was that fight, was he expected to win that fight originally when he lost, when he first lost to Randolph Turpin?
One favorite. Nobody had heard of Randy Turpin. He was over there in a lark. He was winning fights, non-title fights in Paris, in Germany, just picking up a payday here and there. And he goes to England. This is a stopover, grab a few bucks, and then go back on tour. And he loses. And it is a shock of shock. It's inconceivable, the kind of defeat that was. No one could believe it.
That was the 12th. That was the 12th of September, 1951, should I say?
Yes.
Then, unfortunately, Randolph Turpin. Yeah, for the fighters, that achievement was second to none. But for him to, I think the tag he got alongside that was a 64-day champion, which
Absolutely.
Must have really hurt.
I think that Ray was a smart business. They had him so locked up that not only had to give him a rematch within 60 days, he had to do it back in New York, where Ray was from. So he was sort of given this opportunity that he never thought he was going to win. But if he did, he was beholding. Today, John, if that was today, it would be a year between the rematch. Randy would take a couple of smaller fights. As we talked about, the Canelo Golovkin, they fought twice. There was a lot of interest in the third fight. It hasn't even happened yet. So it takes forever. But they had you so locked in then that you better come back, Robinson. And he honestly, they give him credit there. It's as much credit to him that as a champ, he was willing to defend against the best in the world 64 days later, that a Robinson was able to come back and win that title 64 days later. That
kind of reminds me of Sugar Ray Leonard against Roberto Duran after Roberto beat him the first time, and then it was a no mass fight. Roberto was in heaven. He was in heaven because he beat Sugar Ray Leonard, and then the trappings of his success
Yes.
And the devil in the detail in the contract. These two guys had to fight again.
Mm-hmm. And that was 5 months after a chance to take his breath. I think they thought that Duran was going to party so much that he would never be able to overcome that. Similar thing happened when Jose Napoles, after 10 years as a pro, beat Curtis Coates, and they had him locked into a rematch, and he had to fight him 60 days later. But to his credit, he came back and beat him. The great ones can do that, you
know. And is there any more fights that you think, you know what, that was the one that was probably the glory fight to get 61,000 people there to see if Sugar Ray still had it to then put Randolph Turpin in his place. But there were still more glory days after that.
Oh, well, look, when he fought Jake LaMotta, that's his nemesis. They had fought 4 times. LaMotta was, had won 1, Ray had won 3, and he finally meets LaMotta for the middleweight title. Sugar had given up the welterweight championship. LaMotta had never been stopped before. They boxed in Detroit, which is where Ray moved after leaving Georgia and before coming to New York, and he stops him. That was that was an exclamation point at the end of their series. They were all hard fights, all tough fights. This time he stops LaMotta, and there was no question who was the greater fighter. So that was another one. Coming back to regain the title against Gene Fullmer when he was an older fighter. And Fullmer had outpointed him, and he knocks Fullmer out with a perfect punch and sets up the Basilio fight. Beating Basilio when he's 37 years of age, lost to this younger, tougher guy, and comes back and regains the championship in Chicago. And that was another. So many things he did that were all on such a historical note because he was doing them. So I would say the Turpin fight, the victory over LaMotta, even when he lost to Joey Maxim and he was exhausted, head on all 3 cards, and the heat was 100 degrees, and he passes out in the Polo Ground, in the Yankee Stadium, I should say, against Maxim, a much bigger man who had gone on and fought, Archie Moore 3 times and never got stopped. So that was historical. His losses were historical. His wins were historical. Everything he did was larger than life.
Do you think he walked away at the right time? We looked at the likes of Joe Louis and people like that, and I know he walked away in a loss. But you think the timing was right? 1965.
After he lost the fight he came back interesting. He lost 2 split decisions in Boston to Paul Pender, a Boston fighter. The rematch wasn't in New York. I don't know why to this day. Must be a story to be answered there. Then he comes back and fights a draw Gene Fullmer for the title. Close fight, and then loses. He should have retired after the Fullmer fight. Teddy Brenner, the Garden matchmaker, brought him to New York in late, I think 65 or 63 to box Denny Moyer. Went on to become junior middleweight champ, and he just nicked by. And after that, Brenner said, "You began in the Garden, you should end it in the Garden on a win." He should have retired then, but he went on to fight for another 15 fights, and he lost. And most of the fights he lost was at that juncture. About 12 of them after that. He should have never fought after the second Fullmer fight, and certainly not after he'd beaten Denny Moyer. He went on a few years too long. Yes, most definitely. But the Fullmer fight should have been the end of his career, but he did go on, unfortunately, too long.
He still left his mark in history and inspired so many fighters coming through, which to me, if any fighter can do that in a boxing game, you deserve everything you get and the respect from all.
No question. He's still the fighter by which all fighters who ever lived before and after are measured. And I don't see that changing any foreseeable, not in my lifetime for sure.
So we look at the middleweights, and earlier on I said the middleweight division is as exciting as, if you've got a good mix, it can be as exciting as the heavyweight division. Mm-hmm, why is absolutely. That? Why is that? Why is the middleweight division so glamorous?
100 years ago, it was a lightweight division. I mean, I'll tell you what, because it's probably the reflection of the average man's weight. Average man is a middleweight, probably 160, 159. We've gotten larger, but you look up, a heavyweight is a big man. A lightweight is a smaller man. You're right in the middle. So it's a perfect metaphor for the middle, the middle person, the guy, the average. The middle is the average. Middle of the road is average. And the most people can vicariously associate with that guy. That guy looks like me. He doesn't fight like me. I'm not as athletic, but I can identify with that. Whereas the average guy can't identify with a 6'5" heavyweight weighing 280 pounds or a bantamweight or a lightweight because a bit larger than that. But the average person can see themselves in that individual, and he manifests themselves in
that. Again, so let's look at the other middleweights that probably captured one's imagination and try and compare them with the success or the skill, if there are any, of Ray Robinson, past and present. Could you think of any that you could try and compare to Ray?
Well, I mean, I'm hearing historically you hear from the years back, you hear about Stanley Ketchel was a great puncher. You hear about Harry Greb, a phenomenal fighter, although not a great knockout puncher, won 200 bouts. Mickey Walker won titles in 2 different divisions, fought heavyweights, fought light heavyweights. Then there's a big gap between Walker and then go to Robinson. And after the war, I think you start to have the glamour really come into the division. Zale and Graziano, Marcel Cerdan, Jake LaMotta. You've got then a generation later, you start to get into Marvin Hagler, and you get into, Hearns won the middleweight title, Letterman won the middleweight title. Now we got Canelo winning the championship. So as post-World War II, I think it's more reflective of the weight of the average man. But you've always had Carlos Monzon, one of the greatest of all time, for sure. Bernard Hopkins a little bit later in that situation. So you've had great fighters there. And so if you want to measure a guy against the best, you really have a lot of competition to step in there and say who he's, who he's matched against or who he's got to be measured against.
Of course, Sugar Ray Leonard. He's obviously tried to hold that, at least getting the name, some of the skill had rubbed off on it, and it did. He managed to back up the bolts if he's going to take on such an amazing name to try and follow in the sport. You mentioned Canelo. Canelo is. They try to compare him as the greatest, one of the greatest middleweights in the world. Would you agree with that? Canelo's fighting Plant this weekend, I suppose.
Yeah. Today's time, he's probably the outstanding fighter in that weight between 160, 168. I don't know. He's really proved himself. He's won a light heavyweight title, but hasn't really fought the best like Bertabiev, the Russian, who's a very, very profound puncher. Look, he's the best of his time. When you get older, everybody says, "Oh, you're into the past," but there's no way he compares with a Sugar Ray Robinson. I don't think he's great. What has helped him, he's a great phenomenal attraction. So, he gets close decisions that may have gone the other way if he didn't have this charisma of the crowd, and affects the officials as well. I think he's a terrific fighter for his time. I just, there's no question. As we know that Floyd Mayweather beat him, the only defeat of his career, and Mayweather is sort of a smaller version of Sugar Ray Robinson, not a puncher like Ray and a smaller man overall. And he was able to defeat Canelo. So I think he's the best of his time. There's no question. I don't think best of all time.
I'd agree with you. I think Mayweather's win over Canelo is probably now gets the credit it deserves now than I can remember at the time when Mayweather was fighting Canelo. I thought, oh, it's a tall order. The stage you're at in your career, taking on this young man, but the job he did was outstanding. And Canelo learned a hell of a lot from that fight. As a youngster coming through, was nowhere near the finished article. Each time he managed to reinvent himself, change himself, such as like a chameleon, and get even adapt his style. That's what he's forever been doing. So in today's time, I'd agree with you. Comparing him to the likes of Ray Robinson, I'd also agree with you there. I just think Ray Robinson, he was the sort of fighter that he always ahead of his time. Speed, style, agility, and the talent he had all round in and out of the ring. It just made him the character he did.
Yeah, in all fairness to Canelo, I don't think you can compare anybody. As we said at the beginning of the broadcast, you can't compare anybody to Sugar Ray Robinson. He's the fighter that everybody else is compared to. He's the paragon. He's the top of the top. It's like comparing playwrights to Shakespeare. How far do you go? He's the best, then there's everybody.
Well, you know what? It was short and sweet, but I'm looking forward to this weekend's fight with against Plant. Any predictions for that?
I like Canelo by knockout. I think most people are saying that. The one selling point is that it is a unification fight, and to his credit, he wants to become the first man ever to come the undisputed super middleweight title with all 4 organizational championships. He'll win. Just too much Canelo, too much fighter, too much everything. Plant's good. He's not in this guy's class. I don't think the gap between him and Canelo is as great as it is between Canelo and Sugar Ray Robinson, but it's enough that I think Canelo can walk away with a short victory. Although it'll be a good fight because Plant is a champ. He comes to fight. He hasn't lost. He's not going to go and lay down. I think he's going to really, really put out. So good, exciting fight for as long as it lasts. I just think Canelo just blows him away in the end.
Is there anybody out there to test Canelo?
Well, he hasn't fought Golovkin that third time. We bring back Robinson and Lamatters, and that was his nemesis. He fought him 5 times, twice in 16 days. Now it takes 3 years to make a rematch, It'd have to be the next generation coming up, I think, that we'd have to look with. Charlo, give him tough fights. But Turbiev, I think, at a light heavyweight will be a very challenging fight for Canelo if he takes it. That will be a very interesting match, if and when they can make that fight.
Our fight game is so intriguing. Don, it's been a pleasure. Enjoy the rest of your birthday, my friend, and don't get drunk.
God bless. Thank you, guys. Just drunk on the power there. Bye-bye. The thrill of talking to you guys.